I thought I'd start out by saying a couple of words about the Ron Clifton lecture. What about Ron Clifton? Who was he, and why do we have a lecture series? Ron served for 25 years as a senior Foreign Service officer in the United States Department of State. In 1992, Ron brokered a $9 million grant from the United States Information Agency to the Salzburg Seminar to create the American Studies Center. He was the center's first founder and first director, and from 1994 to 1996, he served in that capacity. And over the last 25 years, Ron served as faculty or chair of more than 20 sessions. In 2003, as all grants do, this USIA grant came to an end, and Ron was expired, and Ron was instrumental in helping to found and support the creation of the Salzburg Seminar American Studies Association, SASA. And so since 2003, Ron has designed and implemented 15 symposia on American Studies themes. It was my honor and privilege to serve with him on all of those sessions. In recognition of his many decades of support for American Studies, Salzburg Global decided to create the Ron Clifton Lecture in American Studies. The first lecture took place in 2018, and it was given by Charlie Savage of the New York Times, very successful. And the 2019 Ron Clifton Lecture was given by Reinhard Heinisch. We're very glad that he's with us today. So it is now my great pleasure, which is why I'm here, to introduce Margaret Huang, who is with us for this program. Margaret is a member of the Salzburg Global American Studies Advisory Committee, along with others who are here. And Margaret is the president and chief executive officer of the Southern Poverty Law Center. She's an experienced human rights and racial justice advocate, and she leads the SPLC in its mission to serve as a catalyst for racial justice in the South, dismantling white supremacy, and advancing the human rights of all. She led the adoption of a new strategic framework focusing the organization's work in 4 programmatic areas: eradicating poverty, decriminalizing Black and Brown communities, promoting voter rights and civil engagement, and dismantling hate and extremism. Quite frankly, I can't think of anyone more equipped and deserving than Margaret to present the 2024 Ron Clifton Lecture in American Studies. So please join me in welcoming Margaret.
Well, thank you so much, and especially to Marty, to Charles, to Antonio, to the entire Salzburg team, who have done so much to make this a welcoming and supportive environment. This week is always an incredible pleasure to be surrounded by beautiful scenery, to be in conversation with such esteemed colleagues. I feel very privileged to have been invited to give this year's lecture. So thank you all for having me. I was planning some things for my talk tonight and then spoke to Charles and rewrote the whole thing, which is not unusual. I think that's happened a few times before. But Charles encouraged me to be a little more informal and also a little more autobiographical. So I'm going to do my best. But of course, what I really want to talk about is the work that we're doing at the Southern Poverty Law Center. So maybe I'll go a little lighter on the autobiographical. But I will tell you how I got to the SPLC. So I actually chose my career when I was very young. Some of you heard me say today that I had the chance to travel to China when I was actually quite young with my father and my family. And so I very early decided I was going to become an ambassador. That was my plan. And in my very first semester of college, I quickly realized how completely unsuitable that would be for me. I discovered that I frequently and vehemently disagreed with many U.S. foreign policy positions, so I had to change gears. And I ended up deciding that a career in international human rights advocacy was really more my speed. I spent my first decade of my career advocating for women's rights, especially in Asia, championing the Dalit community in their fight for global recognition of their rights to be free of racism, xenophobia, and other forms of discrimination. I engaged with a lot of UN mechanisms, human rights mechanisms, and the Inter-American system. And I spent a lot of time demanding that governments around the world release their political prisoners. And this work was deeply meaningful for me. I really felt confident in my career trajectory. And then two things happened. The first were the attacks on September 11th. And the second, a few months later, I had my first child. These two very significant events really changed my life in so many ways. First, I realized that the assumptions I had made about human rights in the United States were deeply wrong. We were not a beacon of human rights or even an authority on human rights, given the treatment that I witnessed of Middle East, North Africa, and South Asian colleagues and communities in the post-9/11 environment. And this was a period when I started to understand that this treatment was not new or unique, that in fact it was part of a very long history of human rights abuses inside the United States. I spent a lot of time studying the history of slavery, of genocide, of Jim Crow, of immigration bans and poor policies, starting with the Chinese Exclusion Act in the late 1800s, and so much more. And this was a first for me. I had always had my eyes looking overseas. So then I started turning to current day manifestations. How did this hostile treatment to so many different groups play out today? And I started learning about racial disparities in the United States, in financial security, in access to healthcare, in access to housing, educational attainment, incarceration and immigrant detention rates, and so much more. Having a family was also a pretty significant factor. Somehow I lost some of the enthusiasm for jaunting around the world and visiting new places, but I also realized that I wanted to make my country a place to be proud of. And I wanted my children to grow up in a rights-respecting place. So thus began my exploration of human rights at home. What did it mean to advocate for human rights in the US? And it was an entirely new career. I learned that the language of human rights is foreign to most US policymakers. People would ask me very confused questions about why I was seeking a meeting at the Department of Justice or Health and Human Services, and they would keep pointing at the State Department and saying, "You want to go over there." I learned that members of Congress on both sides of the aisle found international legal obligations to be perfectly lovely ideas that can be pushed aside quickly to get to more expedient issues. I learned that the unfair or disparate treatment of those with less and fewer opportunities, with greater misfortune, was regrettable, but not actionable, despite being legal obligations under international law. And I was even encouraged to go back to law school so that I could sue government instead of demanding policy changes. So over the last 2 decades, I have deepened my understanding that human rights don't mean anything if people are unaware of their rights and if government can't be held accountable. And that is part of my journey of how I got to the Southern Poverty Law Center. Now, the SPLC, as we call it, was founded in 1971 with a very clear mission. During the 1950s and 60s, the US had finally passed a series of civil rights laws intended to extend constitutional protections to communities that had long been ignored and disregarded, and particularly on the basis of race. So the SPLC launched with 3 attorneys and a few other staff, committed to defending those rights as now enumerated in civil rights laws, and to sue governments or private actors if they weren't enforcing them. Today, the organization has more than 400 employees. We have offices in 5 states and Washington, D.C., and we have a budget of more than $100 million each year. And we have one of the largest legal teams in the Deep South. The initial work of the center was actually threefold. So first and foremost, as I said, it was to sue. We like to sue racists, is one of our internal claims. We also sued on behalf of women, we sued on behalf of immigrants, and so many others who are pushed to the margins of US society. And then in 1981, a really important case arose. In 1981, a 19-year-old black man was lynched in Alabama. His name was Michael McDonald. And while there was a very long period of time where the state sought to prosecute the men responsible, Michael's mother really felt that there had to be punishment for those who'd actually ordered and expected the murder, and that would be the Ku Klux Klan. So the Southern Poverty Law Center took on the case, and in 1984, we sued the United Klans of America, and we won, and we put them out of business. This created a legal precedent in the United States for going after extremist organizations, holding them accountable for their bad acts, and actually recovering damages, financial reparation for the families who had been affected. This led to a second area of work for the center, and we began researching and tracking hate groups across the country. We believe our annual report on hate and extremist groups is actually the longest study of extremist organizations, perhaps in the world, but certainly in the United States. We've been doing the report every year since 1990. And just so you know, this year there were more than 1,200 hate and anti-government groups that we identified in every state of the United States. The third area of work started in the early 1990s, when we realized that we were doing all this work to document and to research terrible ideological activities on behalf of organizations, and we weren't doing anything to stop it. And so we developed an educational arm, previously called Teaching Tolerance. When I came on board, we changed the name. Tolerance seemed a little outdated. And so today we call it Learning for Justice. And this organization continues to create educational resources and curricula that we offer for free to teachers and schools around the country. The program today is now evolving even further. We're recognizing that no longer are schools the best teachers for some of this work. We've been talking today about book banning and attacks on curriculum of accurate and true history. So we seek to provide lessons on how to teach hard history if you're a parent, if you're a community leader, a faith leader, or anyone else who wants to make sure that the younger generation understands where we've come from and why it is the way it is today. So when I arrived at the organization in April of 2020, I was facing a number of challenges. Note that date, April of 2020. Anything happening in the world in April of 2020? So yes, there was a global pandemic. Also, I was inheriting the organization from three people who had been with the organization for decades. The founder of the organization, the longtime CEO, and the legal director all left in 2019. And for anyone who's ever taken over an organization from the founder, it can be quite tricky. Marty and I can get into that in the Q&A. And then about 6 weeks later, George Floyd was murdered. And my organization, like every organization in the United States and actually ultimately around the world, was engulfed in thinking about what his murder meant for race relations, for discrimination and harassment, for countering law enforcement and the state that is supposed to protect us from these things. And it made it really, really tricky to navigate with a group of people I had never met in person. In fact, I didn't meet any of my staff for 6 months after I started. It was also an election year, kind of a really important one. And so when I got there, you might wonder, how did I decide what to focus on first? And actually, it was very easy. The Southern Poverty Law Center had never had a strategic plan. In 50 years, 49 at the time, we just did what sounded interesting and good. And for the first time, I proposed that we actually should all agree on a strategic plan. So that's how we spent a couple of years with staff who'd never gone through the process before and who had about as many ideas as all of us could come up with in this room for what the work of the SPLC should be. Perhaps most importantly, my argument was that we didn't know how effective we were being. We hadn't stepped back in 49 years and said, what's working, what's not working? What should be our priorities based on the people that we seek to serve? How do we get their input into setting those priorities? And how do we all agree and align our efforts together? Because if we all worked on the same things, we would actually be far more effective than if we're doing the hundreds of things that we're currently doing now. The result is a new mission of the organization that Marty read. We want to serve as a catalyst for racial justice in the Deep South and beyond. We have a theory that comes from a very old saying, as the South goes, so goes the nation. W.E.B. Du Bois said it a lot, but so did many others. And that drives the way we think about it. Today, if you look at civil rights challenges in the United States that rise up to the national level of debate or Supreme Court consideration, those cases come out of the Deep South. The attacks on women's reproductive health, the attacks on voting rights, there's so many other human rights and civil rights challenges that have emerged from states' litigation efforts where I live. And so we really wanted to emphasize focusing on communities of the South. What are their priorities? What do they want us to be doing in support of them? And on advancing the human rights of all people. So Marty mentioned we had an overarching goal of creating a multiracial, inclusive democracy that works for communities of the South. And we thought we could do it with 4 programmatic areas of work, all of which are enormous, but we're still working on narrowing them down some more. The first is on poverty eradication. And I thought I'd tell you a little bit about what we're doing in each of these areas today. So for the first time, the Southern Poverty Law Center is representing Black communities in the South in land justice litigation. Now, for those of you who may not know, over the last hundreds of years, once Black folks were able to purchase and own property, there were many, many efforts to take that property away. Everything from using heir or inheritance law practices to eminent domain, where states would seize property belonging to Black communities. And as just one example, at the beginning of the 20th century, Black farmers across the country owned as many as 16 million acres of farmland. In 2017, that was down to less than 3, which is about 0.32% of all farmland in the United States. So we're litigating on behalf of communities to try to protect their rights to the land, either individual property rights or collective, because many of these communities started as the first free towns for people who were formerly enslaved, leaving slavery in the Deep South. And this feels like one of the most important things we've sought to take on. By the way, we started with 1 case in Florida, and we're up to 85 2 years later. So it's a big deal. A second area of work, that was on poverty eradication. Second area of work is on protecting democracy and civic engagement, which seems like a really timely thing to be doing at the moment. So we're litigating at the moment in each one of our 5 states. For example, in Georgia, almost 2 years ago, or a year and a half ago, state legislative officials passed a new law that says that you can't give water to people who are standing in line to vote. Now you may think that's a really weird law. Why would they pass that? And the reason is because the state elections board in every state sets the policies and practices for where people get to vote and how many polling booths there are, and therefore how long people have to stand in line. And to no one's surprise, in Georgia, all of the Black neighborhoods of Atlanta had hour-long waits to cast a vote. White suburbs had no wait at all. They walked in, there were plenty of voting booths, they could vote and leave. But in the Black neighborhoods, there were people who waited more than 12 hours to cast their vote in 2020. So the new law was not, hey, we should fix that problem. It was, let's make sure nobody can give them water or food while they're standing in line. So that's actually now a law in Georgia. We're suing on that law. In Alabama, just this past April, the state legislature passed a law that makes it a felony to assist someone in casting a ballot if they're not your immediate family member. So if you have an elderly aunt or a neighbor with disabilities who can't go to the polling place to cast a vote, if you help them fill it out, put it in an envelope, and take it for them to the polling place, you have now committed a felony and can be prosecuted in the state of Alabama. So can the neighbor or the aunt. And remember, if you get convicted of a felony, you lose your right to vote after that. So this is not only a way to discourage people from voting now, but it's also a threat to keep people from voting for a very long time. These are just a couple of the cases that we're currently litigating in our states. On the third area, decarceration and decriminalization, we're challenging a lot of really terrible state laws that are seeking to treat children as legal adults in the criminal legal system. One example is in Louisiana. We learned that the state had decided to put the juvenile justice system into a very infamous prison called Angola. If any of you are familiar with the Angola prison, it was originally a plantation, and the people who used to work the fields were formerly enslaved and today are prisoners of the state of Louisiana. They decided to move the juvenile justice detainees into that prison, which has no facilities for education, no opportunities for rehabilitation, and that's where they were putting children as young as 12 and 14. So we sued them, and we got them moved back out of the prison. But a new governor was just elected this year and has now declared that they will be prosecuting anyone who's at least 17 as an adult in all Louisiana court cases. So we're going to have more challenges in front of us. And then one other thing I'll mention in terms of fighting white supremacy, we've also talked today a lot about some of the challenges to curriculum in schools. And we are representing currently a teacher in Georgia who read a book to her class. She's a 5th grade teacher, and she allowed her students to go to a book fair. It's called the Scholastic Book Fair. For Americans, we all had them in our elementary schools. And she allowed the students to pick which book they would like her to read. So the students voted, they picked out a book, they brought it back to the classroom, she read it to them. The book is called The Color Purple. No, My Shadow is Purple. The Color Purple is another movie. But anyway, My Shadow is Purple. And it is about a young person who talks about how his or her mother is a pink shadow and their father is a blue shadow, but their shadow is purple. And it's very much encouraging young people to understand that we may be different, but we all can still appreciate and value one another and feel welcome as part of a family or a community. She was fired. And she was fired because the book was written to encourage people to be welcoming of transgender or other gender diverse people. And under new state laws, it's not allowed to talk about those things in the public school system. So we're representing her in suing to get her job back, but also more importantly, to allow teachers to read books to their students that are about welcoming diverse communities. A few other things that our new strategic plan enables us to do. We have launched state offices in our states. Now, we've always had places to work in our states, but they've largely been legal office looking like offices that don't encourage people to come in and talk to us, and certainly are not in the communities that we seek to represent. So our new state offices are hiring community organizers who are going out and meeting with community residents and leaders to learn what their key issues are and how our litigation can actually support and advance their efforts. It's a new effort for the SPLC. My lawyers have been asking me a lot of questions about why we're doing community organizing. But I have to remind people that today the judicial system is not protecting civil rights the way it did when we started 50 years ago. We're not going to win more civil rights protections with this Supreme Court, or frankly with our state courts. So we have to find new ways of advocating for changes that involve using the ballot box and getting people engaged in civic action if we want to make those changes happen. And finally, connected to that, we have built up a new political arm. So the SPLC Action Fund endorses candidates who are running for local office in the Deep South. And I know some of my colleagues today were talking about the importance of voting in local elections, because in fact it's local governments that have the closest connection to how people are experiencing their lives each day. So we're endorsing candidates who are running for sheriff, for school board, for judges, because judges are usually elected in the Deep South, for mayor. And our hope is that over the next 10, 20 years, we will have an entirely new field of experienced legislative and other government officials who are ready to transform the South into a much more progressive area. So as we consider the next 50 years of the Southern Poverty Law Center, I bet you would all put money on the fact we will not run out of work to do. The narrative of the Confederacy is still alive and well in the Deep South. It is now openly embraced by one political party as reflective of their values. So fighting white supremacy, protecting the vote, ending the criminalization of communities of color, and eradicating poverty will continue to be vital challenges for us for many years to come. And I invite you all to join us. I'd love to take questions. Thanks.